Subscribe. Sign in. The 1% Gone Bad, Part 4. Open in app. Listen via. The 1% Gone Bad, Part 4. Longevity Lock-in. MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sunu MIX. April 11, 2026. Part 4, The Cyborg Superclass. 16. Longevity Lock-in. Death was the great equalizer. Not in the sentimental sense, not in the sense that death made all lives equal in their value or their dignity or their claim on the world's resources. Death did not do that. The powerful died better than the powerless, in more comfort, with more preparation, with more of the world arranged around the event of their departure. But death made all lives equal in their finitude. The king died. The pharaoh died. The emperor died. The billionaire died. However long the powerful managed to delay it, through medicine, through safety, through the careful management of all the circumstances that kill the poor early, the powerful died. And dying, they vacated. They vacated the offices they held, the decisions they controlled, the relationships they had cultivated, the accumulated advantage they had spent a lifetime constructing. Their heirs inherited the wealth. The heirs did not inherit the specific person. The specific person, the particular combination of judgment, relationship, and accumulated cognitive capital that had made the predecessor powerful, that ended. Death was the reset mechanism. Not a complete reset. Inheritance is real, dynastic advantage is real, the structural privileges transmitted across generations are real. But a partial reset. A disruption. A moment at which the specific power holder was replaced by a different person with different relationships, different judgments, different weaknesses, and the system had to reorganize around the new configuration. Every prior ruling class understood this. Every prior ruling class worked to minimize the disruption, through careful succession planning, through the institutionalization of power structures that could survive the death of individual power holders, through the cultivation of heirs. But the disruption always came. And in the disruption, however managed, the possibility of change existed. The compound has found the answer to the oldest constraint on power. Don't die. Longevity research is the most honest window into the compound's actual priorities, more honest than its stated missions, more honest than its public philosophy, more honest than any document it produces about its vision for humanity's future. What an institution funds is what an institution values. The gap between stated values and funding priorities is the gap between the institution's public face and its operative agenda. Map the capital flowing into longevity research from the compound's founding class, from the technology billionaires, the sovereign wealth funds, the private investment structures associated with the technocratic charter strongholds, and you find a concentration of investment that dwarfs, by orders of magnitude, the investment flowing into the causes these same funders claim as their primary commitments: climate, poverty, global health, education. The stated priorities receive philanthropy. Longevity research receives capital. Philanthropy is what you fund because you believe it matters to the world. Capital is what you fund because you believe it will return something to you. The compound funds longevity research as capital because longevity, if achieved, returns the one thing that capital cannot otherwise purchase. More time. More time to compound the advantage. More time to complete the innovation. More time to finish the wall. More time to close the exit. More time to build the system that will not require the builder's continued presence to continue. And then, having built it, more time to inhabit it. Longevity research is not one thing. It is a cluster of approaches, each targeting a different mechanism of biological aging, that have in common only their direction, the extension of healthy human function beyond the lifespan that the unmanaged body produces. Senolytic therapies, the clearing of senescent cells, the degraded cellular machinery that accumulates with age and generates the inflammatory environment that is the substrate of most age-related disease. These therapies exist, in various forms, now. They are being developed with compound capital. Their availability, in the most effective iterations, is compound controlled. Epigenetic reprogramming, the resetting of the gene expression patterns that drift from their youthful state as the body ages, producing the cellular dysfunction that underlies physical and cognitive decline. The research is advancing rapidly. The therapeutic applications are closer than public reporting suggests. The gap between what the compound's research infrastructure knows and what is publicly available is the gap that compound capital has specifically funded, the gap between the science and its application, where the application is the proprietary product. Telomere maintenance, the preservation of the chromosomal structures whose shortening with each cell division constitutes one of the biological clocks of aging. The mechanism is understood. The intervention is being developed. The development is funded by capital that intends to control the resulting therapy. Metabolic optimization, the ongoing management of the body's energy systems, hormonal architecture, and inflammatory regulation through continuous monitoring and intervention, not curing disease after it develops but maintaining the physiological conditions in which disease cannot develop. The compound's medical infrastructure is already delivering this to its residents. It is not available outside. Neural preservation and enhancement, the maintenance of cognitive function against the neurological changes of aging, and the augmentation of cognitive function beyond the baseline that the aging brain can sustain. This is the longevity intervention the compound most prizes, because the design class's value is cognitive, and cognitive decline is the design class's mortality before biological death arrives. These approaches are not science fiction. They are funded, advanced, partially available in their most complete and integrated form to those inside the compound's medical systems. The compound's residents do not merely live longer. They live longer well, maintaining the cognitive and physical capability that makes their extended lives productive rather than merely extended. This is the distinction the compound understands and that public longevity discourse consistently misses. Living longer is not the goal. Maintaining capability across extended time is the goal. The goal is not an old person. The goal is a person who does not become old, who operates, at 90, at 100, at 120, at the cognitive and physical level that the unaugmented body achieves at 40. The goal is the perpetuation of peak. The political consequences of longevity are not discussed in the research literature. The research literature discusses mechanisms, interventions, efficacy, safety, side effects. The political consequences are discussed, if at all, in the spaces where the compound's governing class thinks about itself, which are not public spaces. The political consequences are these. The end of generational turnover. Every prior governance system derived some portion of its adaptability from the biological fact that the people who ran it died and were replaced by people who had grown up in different circumstances, with different experiences, different relationships, different intuitions about what the situation required. Generational turnover was not only a disruption. It was a correction mechanism, the regular introduction of people whose formation had occurred in the world the prior generation had produced, rather than the world the prior generation had inherited. The new generation saw what the prior generation was too invested in its own prior decisions to see. The new generation questioned what the prior generation had stopped questioning because the questioning had become uncomfortable. Generational turnover was messy. It was often regressive as well as progressive. New generations brought new biases as well as new insights. But it was movement. It was the system's metabolism. The turnover that prevented the system from calcifying around the preferences and the worldviews of whoever had been in power long enough to make those preferences and worldviews feel like permanent truths. Longevity lock-in ends this metabolism. The ruling class that does not die does not turn over. Its members do not become new people. Their relationships do not reset. Their accumulated perspective does not clear. They remain specific people with specific histories, specific investments in prior decisions, specific relationships with each other that have been maintained across decades rather than years, in the positions of power they have occupied for as long as the longevity therapies have been keeping them there. The system does not refresh. It deepens. The prior decisions become more prior. The accumulated perspectives become more entrenched. The governance calcifies not into corruption, necessarily, not into the cynical self-dealing of people who no longer believe in anything, but into the sincere, confident, deeply experienced conviction of people who have been right enough times, across a long enough period, that the possibility of being wrong no longer feels like a live hypothesis. The compounding of advantage. The billionaire who lives 120 years does not merely accumulate twice the wealth of the billionaire who lives 60. They accumulate the wealth of 60 years of compounding applied to the base that the first 60 years generated. The mathematics of compound interest applied to extended lifespans produces wealth concentrations that no inheritance tax, no redistribution mechanism, no democratic intervention could address, because the wealth does not transfer through inheritance. It never stops belonging to the original accumulator. It compounds continuously for as long as the longevity holds. The gap between the extended ruling class and the unextended majority is not the gap between one generation's wealth and the next. It is the gap between a century of compounding and a lifetime of earning. It cannot be bridged. Not by education. Not by opportunity. Not by the most aggressive redistribution a democratic majority could politically sustain, because the extended class's wealth generates, annually, more than redistribution could recover. The longevity lock-in is not a metaphor. It is a mathematical reality. The extended class locks in its advantage not through any particular act of exclusion but through the simple arithmetic of time. More time. More compounding. More compounding. More gap. More gap. More lock-in. The calcification of the network. Power is not only wealth. Power is relationship, the accumulated network of trust, of shared history, of mutual obligation and mutual knowledge that allows the powerful to coordinate faster, more reliably, and at lower cost than any alternative structure. The extended ruling class's network does not reset. The relationships that took decades to build persist across the extended lifetime. The trust that was established through shared experience, shared decisions, shared risks, shared successes and failures, deepens with continued shared experience rather than being disrupted by the deaths and successions that prior ruling classes were forced to manage. The extended class knows each other. Not in the superficial sense of acquaintance. In the deep sense of long experience, of having navigated, together, the decisions that mattered. This depth of relationship constitutes a coordination advantage that no newly formed group can replicate in any reasonable time frame, because the time frame required to build comparable relationship depth is longer than the biological lifetime of the unextended. The outside cannot build the network the compound has. Not because the outside lacks capable people. Because building comparable network depth requires comparable time. And the outside's time is limited by the biological clock that the compound has stopped. The longevity program creates a specific problem that the compound's founders understood and addressed through the same method they addressed every other governance problem. Not politically, but architecturally. The problem is this: a ruling class that does not die is a ruling class that does not vacate, and a ruling class that does not vacate is a ruling class that cannot incorporate the new without displacing the old. Every governance system requires renewal, the entry of new capability, new perspective, new energy, to remain adaptive. In systems with mortality, renewal is guaranteed biologically. The old die. The new take their place. In the longevity compound, renewal must be engineered, deliberately introduced against the structural inertia of a class with every incentive to maintain its position and the biological duration to do so indefinitely. The compound solution is selective admission to longevity. Not every compound inhabitant receives the full longevity program. The program is tiered. The tiers correspond to the compound's assessment of the inhabitant's value to the compound's operation. The highest tier, the founding class, the design class leadership, the governing structure's core members, receives the full program, the complete integrated suite of senolytic, epigenetic, metabolic, and neural interventions that constitute genuine life extension. Lower tiers receive partial programs, maintenance therapies that extend health span modestly, that keep the operational workforce functional longer, but that do not produce the qualitative extension of the highest tier. The lowest tiers, the service class, the managed populations, receive the compound standard healthcare, excellent by outside standards, categorically different from the extension therapies. This tiering is not merely an economic calculation, the allocation of expensive therapies to the most productive. It is a governance mechanism. The full longevity program is restricted to those whose continued existence most benefits the compound, and whose continued existence most depends, for the maintenance of what they have, on the compound's continuation. The extended class is the compound's most reliable constituency for self-perpetuation, not because they are ideologically committed to the compound but because they are biologically invested in it. Their extended lives are the compound's extension. Their continued existence depends on the compound's continued existence. Their loyalty is not sentiment. It is the loyalty of the person whose continued life depends on the continuation of the system keeping them alive. This is the longevity lock-in in its most precise form, not merely the lock-in of the compound's position through the persistence of its ruling class, but the lock-in of the ruling class's loyalty through the biological dependency of their extended lives on the compound's infrastructure. You cannot betray the system that is keeping you alive. Not without consequences that the biology makes immediately legible. The chain is biological. The chain is invisible. The chain is the health you have come to depend on. There is a historical pattern, visible in every ruling class that achieved sufficient insulation from the consequences of its own decisions, of a specific cognitive pathology that develops when power is held without accountability across extended time. Call it the calcification of certainty. The powerful person who has been right many times, who has made decisions under uncertainty and had those decisions vindicated by outcomes, develops, over time, an increasing confidence in the quality of their judgment that is not proportional to the actual reliability of that judgment. The cognitive bias is well documented. Every human being is subject to it. What mortality constrains is its duration, the period across which the bias can compound before the biological reset interrupts it. The powerful person who dies at 70 has accumulated, at most, 40 or 50 years of reinforced certainty. The powerful person who lives to 140 has accumulated a century. The certainty that a century of reinforcement produces is not the healthy confidence of experience. It is something closer to the absolute conviction of the person who has been operating on their own terms, validated by outcomes they selected and interpreted, for long enough that the alternative, that they might be systematically wrong about something that matters, has become literally unthinkable. Not suppressed. Not denied. Unthinkable. The category of self-doubt has been optimized out by a century of confirmation. The extended ruling class does not become evil. It becomes certain. And certainty, held across enough time, by people with enough power, without the corrective pressure of accountability, is more dangerous than evil. Evil can be named. Certainty cannot be challenged from inside. It simply is. The way the compound simply is. The way the wall simply is. The way the threshold simply is. Certain. Permanent. Beyond revision. Because revision requires uncertainty. And the longevity program, across a century of reinforcement, has made uncertainty a condition the governing class no longer remembers how to inhabit. The outside ages. This is the simplest and most complete description of what longevity lock-in does to the relationship between the compound and the majority it has left behind. The outside ages. Its people live the lives that biological time produces, the arc of development and capability and decline that the human body, unintervened, describes across its natural span. They are born. They develop. They reach their peak. They begin to decline. They die. Their children begin the arc again. Their children's children begin it again. Each generation starting from the beginning. Each generation spending its most capable years acquiring what the prior generation acquired before the prior generation declined. Each generation's accumulated wisdom lost at death, not completely. Inheritance is real, culture transmits, but substantially. The specific judgment, the specific relationship, the specific cognitive architecture that decades of experience produces, lost. Rebuilt. Lost again. The outside is on a treadmill whose pace is set by biology. The compound's ruling class has stepped off the treadmill. They do not start from the beginning. They continue from where they were. The century of accumulated judgment remains. The century of accumulated relationship remains. The century of accumulated cognitive architecture remains. And while the outside rebuilds, generation after generation, what each generation loses at death, the compound's ruling class simply continues, accumulating, year by year, decade by decade, the advantage of continuous existence over a majority condemned to start again every generation. The majority that had, once, in a world before the longevity program, a fighting chance. Because the powerful died too and the reset was universal and the treadmill ran at the same pace for everyone. And now does not. The most significant consequence of longevity lock-in is not what it does to the compound. The compound benefits in every quantifiable dimension: more experienced governance, more stable leadership, more deeply networked coordination, more patient long-horizon planning. The most significant consequence is what it does to the concept of the future. Every prior human civilization understood the future as something that did not yet belong to anyone, a space that the present generation was obligated, in some sense, to leave available to subsequent generations who would inhabit it on their own terms. The future was open. The future was common. The future was the inheritance of those not yet born and therefore not yet able to defend their claim, which created, in every functioning civilization, some responsibility on the present toward the future's not yet present inhabitants. Longevity lock-in transforms the future from open to occupied. The compound's extended class does not vacate the future. It inhabits it, continuously, permanently, carrying the present's power into every subsequent decade, occupying the decision-making positions that the future's governance requires, with the century-old certainties that the longevity program has refined into something indistinguishable, from the inside, from wisdom. The future is not open. The future is already full. Full of the present's powerful, who have purchased the right to be there with the longevity capital that bought them the time the future requires. The not yet born will inhabit a future whose key positions are already occupied, whose resources are already compounded, whose networks are already calcified, whose governance structures are already optimized around the preferences of people who were born before their grandparents and who have no intention of leaving. The future belongs to those who can afford to live in it. The rest will visit, briefly, and then vacate, to make room for their children to visit briefly in turn. While the compound's founding class remains, decade after decade, in the future that was supposed to be for everyone, taking up the space that inheritance used to clear but that longevity has made permanently occupied. Power has always sought to perpetuate itself. This is not the observation. The observation is what happens when perpetuation is achieved, when the mechanism of perpetuation is not institutional but biological, when the system that power has built to extend itself is not a dynasty that can be overthrown or an ideology that can be refuted or an institution that can be reformed, but a body that simply does not stop. The body is the argument. The body's continuation is the governance. The body's health is the system's legitimacy, because the system exists to maintain the body and the body exists to operate the system and the system is the compound and the compound is the wall and the wall is the perimeter and the perimeter is the answer to every question about what the compound owes to those outside it. The answer being, nothing. Because owing requires time, requires the sense that the debt will eventually come due, that the creditor will eventually be in a position to collect, that the mortality of the powerful will eventually produce a moment of reckoning. And the longevity program has postponed the mortality indefinitely. Which means the debt is deferred indefinitely. Which means, in the arithmetic of the extended class's planning horizon, the debt does not exist. Death was democratic, not in the sense that it treated everyone equally, it did not, it never did, but in the sense that it was universal. The king died, the king always died, and in the dying, the future opened, briefly, incompletely, imperfectly, but opened. A crack in the certainty. A space in the occupied future. A moment in which the system had to reorganize around someone new, and the someone new was not yet certain, was not yet calcified, had not yet spent a century being confirmed, and in that uncertainty, in that soft new tissue of unconsolidated power, something was possible that the century of certainty had made impossible. The longevity program ends this, not the king's mortality, the crack, the possibility that lives inside the crack. The future closes, the occupied future, the future that is already full of people who bought their way into permanent residence, and now inhabit it as they inhabit the compound, Behind a wall with a perimeter with sensors that detect approach and parameters that define who may enter and who may not. The future has a gate, the gate has a threshold, the threshold is biological, and the biology belongs to them. 17. Neural augmentation monopoly. The mind was the last commons. Every other human resource had been enclosed, privatized, commodified, extracted from common access and reconstituted as property belonging to those with the capital to claim it. Land was enclosed. Water was enclosed. The electromagnetic spectrum was enclosed. Genetic sequences were enclosed. The algorithms that organized digital attention were enclosed. The platforms through which human beings communicated were enclosed. Each enclosure followed the same sequence. The resource existed as common or unowned. The resource was identified as valuable, capital moved to claim it, law was written to legitimize the claim, and what had been available to all became available to those who could afford access. The mind resisted this sequence. Not through political protection, no democratic movement organized specifically to defend cognitive commons. Through biology. The mind was inside the skull. The skull was inside the body. The body was the person. And the person, whatever else could be done to them, however thoroughly their external circumstances could be shaped and constrained and impoverished, retained, inside the skull, a cognitive space that capital could influence but could not directly access. You could educate the mind, or deprive it of education. You could nourish the brain, or starve it. You could organize the environment to produce certain kinds of thinking and suppress others. But you could not enter. You could not insert a capability or remove a limitation or directly alter the architecture through which the person encountered and processed the world. The mind was not free. But it was private. The last private space, the one enclosure that could not be enclosed because the enclosure was the person themselves. Neural augmentation is the technology that ends this. Not metaphorically. Architecturally. The interface between the mind and the external system, the direct connection between the brain's electrochemical processes and the compound's computational infrastructure, is the final enclosure. The last commons entered. Neural augmentation in its current and near-term forms is not the science fiction version, not the wholesale replacement of biological cognition with silicon architecture, not the uploading of consciousness to digital substrate. It is more modest in its immediate expression and more consequential in its structural implications than either the utopian or dystopian imaginings that dominate public discussion of the technology. It is, in its initial forms, the addition of layers. Layers of capability added to the existing biological architecture, not replacing what the brain does but extending it, in the specific directions the compound has determined are most valuable. Memory extension. The biological brain's memory is reconstructive, lossy, and subject to interference. The augmented layer adds a precise, searchable, comprehensive external memory, a record of everything the augmented person has experienced, accessible instantly, perfectly indexed, cross-referenced with the compound's information systems. The augmented person does not merely remember. They retrieve. With a precision, a completeness, and a speed that biological memory cannot approach. The unaugmented person encounters a situation and searches their imperfect biological memory for relevant prior experience. The augmented person encounters the same situation and has, instantly available, not only their own prior experience but the compound's entire relevant knowledge base, cross-referenced, ranked by relevance, presented in the format their cognitive profile processes most efficiently. The unaugmented person is operating from their brain. The augmented person is operating from their brain plus the compound's infrastructure. The difference in cognitive capability is not incremental. It is categorical. Analytical amplification. The biological brain's analytical capability, its capacity to hold multiple variables in simultaneous consideration, to model the interactions between them, to project the consequences of their various combinations, is limited by working memory, by attention bandwidth, by the energy cost of sustained analytical effort. The augmented layer removes these limits. The analytical effort that would exhaust the biological brain after hours of sustained concentration is distributed across the augmented architecture, the biological component handling the aspects that biological cognition does best, the computational component handling the aspects that exhaust biological cognition fastest. The augmented analyst does not tire in the way the unaugmented analyst tires. The analytical bandwidth available to them does not decline over the course of a working session in the way biological cognitive resources deplete. They think longer. They think more completely. They think at a quality that sustained biological attention cannot maintain. Communication augmentation. Language, the biological brain's primary interface with other biological brains, is slow, lossy, and subject to the ambiguities of shared and unshared reference. The augmented communication layer does not replace language. It supplements it with a higher bandwidth channel, the direct transmission of structured information between augmented minds that does not require the conversion of thought into language and language back into thought. Augmented colleagues do not merely talk to each other. They communicate, at a bandwidth, a precision, and a speed that language cannot achieve. The compounds design class, augmented and networked, constitutes a cognitive system that no collection of unaugmented individuals can match, not because any individual augmented mind is incomparably superior to any individual unaugmented mind, but because the augmented network's coordination capability exceeds anything that language-mediated collaboration can produce. They do not think together. They think as together, a genuinely collective cognitive process that the augmentation makes possible and that has no adequate prior analog. The neural augmentation monopoly does not emerge from a single decision. It emerges from the structure of the technology, from the specific characteristics of neural augmentation as an infrastructure that make monopoly the natural endpoint of the technology's development. Network effects. The augmented mind's value is proportional to the size and quality of the network it connects to. The first augmented person's enhancement is modest. They have access to a powerful computational layer but no other augmented minds to network with. As the network grows, each addition increases the value of every existing connection. The augmented network that has 10,000 members is not 10,000 times more valuable than the single augmented person, it is many more times more valuable than that, because the value of the network is not additive but multiplicative. This means the largest augmentation network has a compounding advantage over any smaller network, an advantage that grows with each new member, that makes the largest network increasingly attractive relative to smaller alternatives, that generates the gravitational pull toward a single dominant network that network effects always produce. The compound builds the largest augmentation network. The largest network attracts the most capable augmented minds. The most capable minds generate the most valuable network activity. The most valuable network activity makes the compound's network more attractive than any alternative. The monopoly is not imposed. It is the mathematical consequence of network effects applied to cognitive augmentation. Infrastructure dependency. The augmented mind's capability depends on continuous connection to the compound's infrastructure. This is not a design flaw. It is the design. The augmentation is not a device you carry. It is an interface between your biology and a computational architecture that belongs to the compound. The cognitive capabilities the augmentation provides, the memory retrieval, the analytical amplification, the high bandwidth communication, are not stored in the augmented mind. They are performed, continuously, by the compound's computational systems in response to the augmented mind's requests. Disconnect from the compound's infrastructure, and the augmentation does not degrade. It stops. The augmented person, disconnected from the compound's systems, is left with their biological cognition, minus the atrophied capabilities that the augmentation has been performing for them, minus the cognitive habits built around augmented capability that biological cognition cannot support, minus the institutional and professional context that was built around the assumption of continuous augmentation. The disconnected augmented person is not merely the unaugmented person they were before. They are the unaugmented person they were before minus the capabilities they lost to augmentation-induced atrophy plus the disorientation of operating in a world built for augmented cognition without the augmentation. Dependency is not incidental to the technology. Dependency is the technology's primary political feature. The augmented mind is the compound's most loyal inhabitant not because it is ideologically committed to the compound but because its cognitive capability, the capability on which its professional identity, its social standing, its self-understanding are built, depends on the compound's infrastructure the way the biological brain depends on the skull. Remove it and the person is diminished. Diminished in ways they feel immediately, continuously, in every cognitive task the augmentation had been performing. The loyalty is neurological. The monopoly consolidates through a sequence that the compound did not have to plan in its specific steps, because the sequence is the natural consequence of deploying a network effect technology with infrastructure dependency in an environment where the compound has capital, talent, and temporal advantage over every potential competitor. Phase 1, Premium Access. The augmentation is introduced as a premium offering, available to those who can afford it, positioned as a productivity tool for high-value cognitive workers. This phase builds the initial network, establishes the compound's infrastructure as the platform, and begins the process of professional integration, the embedding of augmentation into the workflows of the people who adopt it, making the augmentation gradually indispensable to the professional contexts in which it operates. Phase 2, Competitive Necessity. As the augmented network grows, the unaugmented high-value cognitive worker finds themselves at a systematic disadvantage relative to their augmented peers. Not because any single augmented person is incomparably superior, the individual advantage is real but not overwhelming in the early phases. Because the augmented workers, networked together, produce collective outputs that unaugmented individuals cannot match in speed, cannot match in completeness, cannot match in the quality of synthesis that augmented networks achieve. The professional context shifts. The augmented network's output becomes the benchmark. The benchmark that the unaugmented individual is evaluated against. The unaugmented individual is not evaluated against what an unaugmented individual can reasonably achieve. They are evaluated against what augmented networks produce, because augmented networks are what the compound's high-value cognitive work now requires. The choice to remain unaugmented becomes, progressively, the choice to be professionally uncompetitive. Phase 3, Social Integration. The augmented communication layer, the high-bandwidth channel between augmented minds, creates a social environment within the augmented network that the unaugmented cannot fully access. Not because the unaugmented are excluded, the augmented still communicate in language, still interact socially in conventional ways. But because the augmented network has, alongside the conventional, a richer channel, a layer of communication and shared reference that the unaugmented cannot perceive and therefore cannot participate in. The augmented colleagues share something the unaugmented colleague is not part of. The social world of the compound's design class has a dimension the unaugmented cannot enter, not by prohibition, but by architecture. Remaining unaugmented means remaining at the margin of the social world that the augmented network constitutes, present but not fully present, connected but not fully connected, in the room but not in the conversation that the room's dominant occupants are having. Phase 4, Cognitive Normalization. The augmentation has been present long enough that the generation now entering the design class has never known professional life without it. For this generation, augmentation is not an addition to cognition. It is the baseline of cognition, the assumed starting point from which professional capability is measured. The unaugmented mind is not, for this generation, the natural mind with optional enhancement. It is the impaired mind, the mind operating below the capability that the professional context assumes as standard. The framing has inverted. Augmentation is no longer augmentation. It is simply thinking. And the unaugmented mind is the mind that cannot quite keep up, that processes too slowly, remembers too imprecisely, analyzes too shallowly, communicates too loosely. To function at the level that the cognitive environment now demands. The monopoly is complete not when the compound controls access to the technology, though it does, but when the compound controls the definition of what counts as cognition. The neural augmentation monopoly produces a specific form of inequality that differs from every prior form in a characteristic that makes it uniquely resistant to the political responses that prior inequalities generated. Prior inequalities were external. The poor person was outside the wealthy person's house. The excluded person was outside the institution's gate. The unaugmented person was outside the augmented person's network. The inequality was visible as inequality, as the gap between what some had and what others lacked, expressed in the external world in ways that could be pointed to, organized around, contested. Neural augmentation inequality is internal. The augmented person does not merely have more. The augmented person is cognitively different from the unaugmented person in ways that are not external but constitutive. The difference is not in what they own. It is in what they can do. In how they think. In the quality and speed and completeness of the cognitive processes through which they encounter the world. The unaugmented person, encountering the augmented person in a professional context, does not merely feel disadvantaged. They feel, if they are honest, and the experience of those near the augmentation threshold confirms this. Slow. They feel the specific quality of cognitive inadequacy that comes from operating in an environment calibrated to augmented capability. The thinking that comes naturally. The retrieval that is instant. The synthesis that happens without effort. The communication that conveys in seconds what language takes minutes to approximate. None of it is available to the unaugmented mind. And the unavailability is felt not as external exclusion but as internal limitation. This is the inequality that is hardest to organize against. External inequality produces a political subject who knows they are being denied something they deserve, who can name what is being denied, who has a claim, and the claim has an address. Internal inequality, the inequality of constituted capability, produces a political subject who experiences their condition as personal inadequacy. Not as the consequence of a system that has decided their cognition is not worth augmenting. As the simple fact of being less capable than those around them. Which feels like biology, not politics, like the natural order, not a governance decision. Like what they are, not what has been done to them. The neural augmentation monopoly does not produce an underclass that knows itself as an underclass. It produces an underclass that experiences itself as simply less. And attributes the less to itself. Access to the monopoly's infrastructure is the defining question of entry by cognitive value at its deepest level. The compound does not merely assess cognitive value. It assesses cognitive value relative to the augmented baseline. The entry threshold is set in augmented terms, in the terms of what augmented minds produce, and evaluated against candidates who may or may not be augmented at the time of assessment. The unaugmented candidate is assessed against a standard that the standard-setting class meets with augmentation. If the unaugmented candidate is sufficiently talented to meet that standard without augmentation, they are admitted. They are then augmented. Their capability increases substantially. They now exceed the threshold they barely met without augmentation. If the unaugmented candidate cannot meet the augmented standard without augmentation, they are not admitted. They are therefore not augmented. Their capability does not increase substantially. They remain below the threshold. The threshold, calibrated to the augmented, does not lower to meet them. The entry system assesses unaugmented candidates against augmented standards and admits those who survive the assessment into an environment that then augments them. While those who could not survive the assessment without augmentation are excluded from the augmentation that would have allowed them to survive it. The threshold produces the inequality it claims to be measuring. The compound selects for natural capability that exceeds the augmented standard, which is to say, it selects for capability so exceptional that augmentation represents a further amplification of excellence rather than a compensation for limitation. It selects the exceptional and makes them more exceptional. It does not augment the capable and make them exceptional. The augmentation is not an elevator. It is a multiplier. Multiplied by 0 is still 0. Multiplied by exceptional is something beyond the scale the unaugmented world uses to measure. The monopoly on neural augmentation is the monopoly that completes all other monopolies, the one from which all subsequent advantages flow with a comprehensiveness and a self-reinforcing momentum that no prior monopoly achieved. The monopoly on land produced the feudal lord. The monopoly on capital produced the industrial baron. The monopoly on information produced the platform billionaire. The monopoly on cognition produces something for which we have not yet developed adequate language. Because the prior monopolies controlled external resources that the unmonopolized mind could contest, could organize against, could build alternatives to, could, at sufficient scale and sufficient organization, overcome. The feudal lord's land could be seized. The industrial baron's factory could be occupied. The platform billionaires network could be regulated or abandoned for alternatives. The augmented mind's cognitive advantage cannot be seized, cannot be occupied, cannot be regulated without regulating the capability itself, which requires the political will to make the population less capable, which no democratic majority will vote for once augmentation is sufficiently widespread among the voting class. And cannot be abandoned for alternatives because the alternatives do not exist. The monopoly has ensured this, and because abandoning augmentation means becoming less capable than you currently are, which is not an act most people are willing to perform as an act of political solidarity with those who were never augmented in the first place. The neural augmentation monopoly is the monopoly that secures all prior monopolies, that places, behind every prior advantage, the cognitive architecture that can defend it, extend it, and prevent the challenges that every prior monopoly eventually faced. Landed monopoly fell to organized labor. Industrial monopoly fell to regulatory democracy. Platform monopoly fell to, is falling to, the accumulated pressure of democratic institutions that may yet limit its reach. Cognitive monopoly falls to nothing that has yet been organized, because organizing requires the cognitive capability that the monopoly controls, and the cognitive capability that the monopoly controls is not available to those who would use it to organize against the monopoly. The compound does not need to suppress opposition. It needs only to maintain the monopoly that makes opposition cognitively insufficient to matter. The neural augmentation monopoly has a horizon that its architects consider with more care than any other long-term planning question. The horizon is the point at which the augmentation gap, the cognitive distance between the augmented class and the unaugmented majority, becomes large enough to constitute a difference not of degree but of kind. Not, the augmented are smarter than the unaugmented. But, the augmented and the unaugmented are no longer operating in the same cognitive universe, are no longer reasoning about the same problems in commensurable ways, are no longer, in any sense that prior philosophy of mind would recognize as meaningful, thinking together. This horizon is not a sharp threshold. It is a gradient, a progressive widening of the cognitive gap that crosses, at some point, the line beyond which the two populations cannot be said to share a common intellectual world. When that crossing occurs, when the augmented mind's cognitive architecture has been extended far enough that the unaugmented mind cannot follow the reasoning, cannot evaluate the claims, cannot meaningfully participate in the discourse through which the decisions that govern both populations are made, the pretense of shared governance becomes untenable. Not because anyone decides it is untenable. Because the cognitive gap makes it structurally impossible, makes the participation of the unaugmented in the governance of a world shaped by augmented cognition as meaningful as a child's participation in a doctoral seminar, present, perhaps, accommodated, perhaps, but not constitutive of the outcome. The compound's architects see this horizon. They see it as the completion of the project, the point at which the cognitive basis for democratic governance is not merely weakened but dissolved. The point at which the question of what the augmented owe the unaugmented can be answered, honestly, in the language of the gap. Nothing that requires their understanding, nothing that requires their consent, nothing that requires their participation in a discourse they can no longer follow. The horizon is not a future event. It is a present trajectory. And the trajectory, extrapolated forward at the rate the compound's augmentation research is advancing, arrives sooner than the unaugmented world has been permitted to understand. They said, we are enhancing human capability, and it was true, they said, the augmented mind is still a human mind, and it was true, for a time, they said, this technology will eventually be available to everyone, and this was the statement that was true in the way that all statements are true when the word eventually is doing all the work, eventually meaning, when we have extracted every advantage the period of exclusive access can provide, when the monopoly has served its purpose, when the gap is wide enough that sharing some of it does not threaten what the gap has built, eventually, the word that means never in the language of systems that benefit from the delay, the unaugmented world waits. It waits with the cognitive tools available to it, the unaugmented brain, the biological memory, the language speed communication, the thinking that tires and the attention that wanders and the working memory that holds 7 things plus or minus 2, and it is told, eventually, and it believes this because it must. Because the alternative is to understand that the mind was the last commons and the commons has been enclosed and the enclosure is inside your skull and the inside of your skull is the one place you thought they could not reach, and they have reached it, not with force, with an offer, and the offer was accepted by those who could afford it and declined, involuntarily, by those who could not, and the mind that was the last commons is now the first property, owned by those inside the wall, behind the perimeter, in the compound where cognition itself has found its enclosure. 18. Intelligence stratification. Every society has stratified. This is not the observation that requires defense. Every human civilization on record has organized itself into layers of access, of authority, of resource, of the specific combination of privilege and obligation that constitutes a social position and determines, with more or less rigidity depending on the civilization, what a person born into that position can expect their life to contain. Caste, class, estate, tribe. The vocabulary differs. The structure is consistent. What differs across civilizations is not whether stratification occurs but what it is organized around, what the principle of differentiation is, what characteristic places one person above another, what the criterion is by which the layers are distinguished and the distinctions maintained. Birth organized the feudal stratification. Ritual purity organized the caste stratification. Capital organized the industrial stratification. Party membership organized the Soviet stratification. Each organizing principle generated a specific kind of social order, specific inequalities, specific pathologies, specific mechanisms of reproduction, specific vulnerabilities to challenge and change. And each organizing principle, when it was the dominant principle, presented itself not as a choice, not as one possible way of organizing the distribution of power and resource, but as the natural order, the way things simply are, the reflection of some deeper truth about human beings and their differences, the arrangement that corresponds to what people actually are rather than what any particular system has decided they should be. The serf did not experience feudal stratification as a political choice that could be unmade. The serf experienced it as the order of things, as the world. The intelligence stratification of the compound is the newest version of this oldest operation, the conversion of a chosen principle of differentiation into an apparent natural law. With the specific advantage, over all prior versions, that this time the principle is measurable, is continuously updated, and corresponds to something real in a way that blood and purity and capital only partially and imperfectly did. Intelligence is real. Cognitive capability is real. The differences between human beings in their capacity to reason, to model, to create, these differences are real. This is what makes intelligence stratification the most durable stratification yet devised, and the most dangerous. Intelligence stratification is not new. Every meritocratic system stratifies by intelligence, that is the definition of meritocracy, or one of its definitions. The university stratifies by demonstrated cognitive capability. The corporation stratifies by cognitive contribution. The professional hierarchy stratifies by expertise. What is new in the compound is not stratification by intelligence. What is new is the following. First, the stratification is no longer merely organizational, determining who leads and who follows within a shared system. It is existential, determining access to the biological and cognitive substrates of capability itself. The prior stratification determined your position. The compound stratification determines what kind of being you are. Second, the stratification is self-reinforcing in a biological sense that prior stratifications were not. Prior stratifications could be contested because the stratification did not alter the capacity for contestation. The serf who organized a revolt did not need the feudal lord's blood to think strategically. The worker who organized a union did not need the industrialist's capital to plan effectively. The intelligence stratification of the compound alters the capacity for contestation by altering the cognitive capability of those who might contest, widening the gap, continuously, between those who direct the system and those who experience it. Third, the stratification is presented in a vocabulary, the vocabulary of cognitive capability, of measurable intelligence, of objective assessment, that is specifically resistant to the challenge that prior stratifications eventually faced, the challenge of demonstrating that the organizing principle is arbitrary, that the hierarchy it produces reflects power rather than nature, that the difference between lord and serf or owner and worker is constructed rather than given. The intelligence hierarchy is harder to expose as constructed because the differences it organizes around are real, because cognitive capability genuinely differs between people, because these differences genuinely matter for what people can do and what they can contribute. The question the stratification forecloses, the question that must be asked before intelligence stratification can be contested, is not: are people cognitively different? They are. The question is: who decided that this particular dimension of cognitive difference is the one that determines social position? Who chose the metric? Who benefits from the choice? And what is lost? What human capabilities, what forms of value, what dimensions of intelligence that the metric does not measure, in the organization of a civilization around this particular selection? This question cannot be asked from inside the scoring system. The scoring system does not have a field for it. The intelligence stratification of the compound operates across 4 distinct levels, not as a formal designation, not as an announced hierarchy, but as the emergent social architecture of a system that distributes access to augmentation, to information, to governance participation, and to the biological extension of life according to its assessment of cognitive value. The augmented governing class. At the apex, the small population whose cognitive augmentation is most complete, most integrated, and most deeply networked, the founding generation of the compound's ruling structure, extended by longevity therapies to decades of continued operation, augmented by neural interfaces to cognitive capabilities that the unaugmented mind cannot approach, networked through high-bandwidth cognitive channels to a collective intelligence that exceeds any individual's. This class does not rule through force alone, though force is available to it. It rules through the cognitive gap, through the simple fact that its members can model situations, anticipate consequences, design interventions, and coordinate responses at a speed and a quality and a completeness that no challenger can match. The augmented governing class is not merely more powerful. It is more capable, and the capability is indistinguishable, from the outside, from a kind of wisdom, the appearance of knowing more, seeing further, understanding the situation with a clarity that the less augmented cannot independently verify but cannot effectively dispute. The governance of this class does not require the consent of those it governs. It requires only that those it governs cannot produce a coherent alternative, cannot model the situation better, cannot coordinate more effectively, cannot demonstrate that the governing class's judgment is wrong in ways they can articulate to an audience capable of understanding the articulation. The cognitive gap is the governance. The governance is the gap. The augmented design class. Below the governing class but above the broad population, the researchers, engineers, architects, and strategists whose augmented cognitive capabilities are the compound's primary productive resource, the class whose work generates the innovations that maintain the compound's advantage and whose continued performance justifies the augmentation investment the compound has made in them. This class is augmented, but not fully. Its augmentation is calibrated to productive contribution, maximizing output in the domains the compound needs while maintaining the dependency architecture that keeps the design class's cognitive capability tethered to the compound's infrastructure. The design class thinks with compound augmented minds. But the compound's augmentation does not fully include the design class in the governing class's cognitive network, the highest bandwidth channels, the deepest augmentation layers, the most complete integration with the compound's analytical and decision-making systems. The design class experiences the augmentation as personal capability enhancement, as the expansion of what they can individually do. What they do not experience, what the tiered architecture specifically prevents them from experiencing, is the governing class's collective cognitive process, the networked intelligence of the fully augmented that constitutes the compound's actual decision-making. The design class is augmented enough to be indispensable, not augmented enough to govern. The gap between the two augmentation levels is not communicated as a governance gap. It is experienced as a capability difference, as the natural consequence of different roles requiring different levels of cognitive augmentation. It is not natural. It is designed. The partially augmented operational class. The broader population of compound inhabitants whose cognitive augmentation is real but substantially less complete than the design class above them, the managers, technicians, analysts, administrators who run the compound's operational systems, implement the design class's innovations, maintain the day-to-day functioning of the compound's complex internal economy. This class is augmented enough to be effective. augmented enough to be dependent on the augmentation. Augmented enough to experience the compound as natural, as the system calibrated to their cognitive mode, the environment organized around their augmented capabilities, and to experience the outside as alien, as the place where their augmentation does not function, where their cognitive infrastructure does not connect, where they would be, without the compound systems, less than they have become. The partial augmentation of the operational class is the compound's most precise governance instrument, more precise than any physical perimeter, more reliable than any loyalty mechanism, more durable than any ideological commitment. The operational class is cognitively invested in the compound in the most literal sense. The compound has invested in their cognition, and their cognition now requires the compound to function at the level they have become accustomed to functioning at. Their loyalty is not purchased. It is neurological. The unaugmented periphery. Below the partial augmentation threshold, the populations that the compound has not augmented, the service workers at the compound's margins, the managed populations in the surrounding territories, the abandoned majority in the outside world. Unaugmented not because augmentation is unavailable in principle, the technology exists, but because the compound has not assessed them as worth augmenting. Their cognitive contribution, in the compound's valuation, does not justify the infrastructure investment that augmentation requires. The unaugmented periphery is not cognitively undifferentiated. It contains within it the full range of human cognitive capability, the brilliant and the average, the creative and the methodical, the analytical and the intuitive, all operating with the biological brain's unaided capabilities. The unaided capabilities are not nothing. The unaugmented human mind is still the most sophisticated biological computing system that 4 billion years of evolution has produced. But it is operating in a world increasingly calibrated to augmented cognition, increasingly organized around the outputs of augmented minds, increasingly requiring, for effective participation in the decisions that matter, the capabilities that augmentation provides. The unaugmented mind in an augmented world is not stupid. It is operating on the wrong infrastructure, the infrastructure of the prior civilization, the cognitive equipment of the pre-augmentation era, the biological tools that were state-of-the-art before the compound decided to fund something better. The unaugmented periphery is not a permanent condition for all its members. Individuals from the periphery who demonstrate sufficient natural capability to meet the compound's augmented threshold may be admitted to augmentation, and are, selectively, when the compound's talent requirements demand it. These individuals are recruited. Their natural capability is the raw material that augmentation will multiply. Their recruitment is framed as opportunity, as the compound's meritocratic openness to cognitive capability wherever it is found. The recruitment is real. It is also the compound's most effective mechanism for preventing the unaugmented periphery from retaining the exceptional natural capability that might, if it remained in the periphery, constitute the leadership of a challenge. The compound does not suppress the gifted outside. It recruits them, augments them, integrates them into the compound's cognitive architecture, and in doing so, depletes the outside of the specific capability most required to contest the compound's dominance. The recruitment is the suppression. The opportunity is the extraction. The open door is the drain. Intelligence stratification produces a social world that is, on its surface, extraordinarily functional, and, at its depth, more rigidly hierarchical than any prior stratification has managed to be. The surface functionality is real. The compound's cognitive layers work. The augmented governing class makes decisions of a quality and a consistency that prior governing structures could not approach. The design class produces innovations at a rate and a quality that accelerates the compound's advantage. The operational class runs the compound systems with the efficiency that partial augmentation enables. The hierarchy functions. And functioning hierarchies are the hardest to contest, not because their members are coerced into acceptance but because the hierarchy's outputs are difficult to dispute. The compound is well governed. The compound's residents experience it as well governed. The decisions are good, by the metrics that matter inside the compound. The systems work. The environment is stable. The quality of life, within the compound, is genuinely superior to what is available outside. The hierarchy that produces this is not resented, largely, because it is experienced as competence, as the natural consequence of more capable people making better decisions for the benefit of those they govern. The cognitive stratification is the feudal hierarchy with one critical difference from the feudal original. The feudal lord was not actually superior. The blood that made them lord was not actually superior blood. The hierarchy rested on a claim, divine right, noble lineage, that was, at its core, a fiction. The intelligence hierarchy is not resting on a fiction. The augmented governing class is more capable, by the metrics the compound has chosen to measure, in the cognitive dimensions the compound has chosen to augment, for the problems the compound has chosen to prioritize. The capability is real, which makes the hierarchy feel natural in a way the feudal hierarchy never quite managed, and which makes the challenge to the hierarchy require not just the exposure of a lie but the much harder task of challenging a truth. The social psychology of intelligence stratification produces specific adaptations in each layer that maintain the stratification stability more reliably than any external enforcement could. At the governing class level, the adaptation is cognitive closure, the progressive narrowing of the questions the governing class considers worth asking, as the questions it already knows how to answer become more sophisticated and the questions that fall outside its competence become harder to recognize as questions. The governing class becomes, over time, extraordinarily capable within its domain and progressively incapable of perceiving the limits of that domain. Its intelligence is real. Its intelligence is also a filter, and the more powerful the filter, the more completely it excludes what the filter cannot process. At the design class level, the adaptation is competitive anxiety, the specific psychological pressure of operating in a cognitive environment where your performance is continuously measured against other high-capability augmented peers, where the gap between your current augmentation level and the governing class's full augmentation is always visible, and where the path to that higher level runs through the compound's assessment of your continued productive value. The design class works harder than any prior professional class in history, not because it is compelled to, but because the anxiety of relative cognitive position is more motivating than any external compulsion could be. At the operational class level, the adaptation is cognitive provincialism, the gradual narrowing of the operational class's conceptual world to the domain in which its partial augmentation operates. The operational class becomes very good at what it does within the compound's systems. It becomes progressively less capable of imagining alternatives to those systems, not because it is forbidden to imagine them, but because imagination, like any cognitive capability, requires exercise, and the operational class's augmentation is calibrated to optimize within existing systems rather than to generate alternatives. The compound's operational class is not docile. It is shaped, cognitively shaped, through the specific capabilities its augmentation develops and those it leaves undeveloped, toward the cognitive profile most useful to the compound and least threatening to it. At the unaugmented periphery level, the adaptation is cognitive inferiority complex, the experience of operating in a world calibrated to augmented cognition while using unaugmented tools, producing the pervasive sense of inadequacy that the stratification was designed to produce without producing the political subject that recognizes inadequacy as injustice. The periphery does not, for the most part, organize around intelligence stratification. It experiences intelligence stratification as natural, as the cognitive order of things, and experiences its own position within that order as a personal condition rather than a political one. This last adaptation is the stratification's most complete achievement, the production of a subordinate class that accepts its subordination as the honest accounting of its worth. Intelligence stratification has a specific relationship to democracy that the compound's architects understand very well and that democratic theorists have been slow to articulate. Democratic theory assumes cognitive commensurability, the assumption that the citizens who deliberate and vote and hold power accountable are, while differing in information and in interest, not so different in basic cognitive capability that the less capable citizens are structurally unable to evaluate the claims and the decisions of the more capable. The voter may not be an economist, but the voter can understand economic consequences, can feel them, can evaluate them against prior experience, can make the judgment that the policy is or is not working based on the life they are living. The voter may not be a scientist, but the voter can evaluate the scientist's claims against the evidence the voter can observe, can assess the scientist's track record, can make reasonable judgments about whether to extend trust. Democratic accountability functions because the accountability relationship does not require cognitive equality, only cognitive commensurability. The governed can evaluate the governors because the governed are not so far below the governors in the relevant cognitive capabilities that evaluation is structurally impossible. Intelligence stratification destroys this commensurability. When the governing class's cognitive capabilities are augmented far enough beyond the governed classes, when the decisions the governing class makes are based on analyses that the unaugmented mind cannot reproduce or verify, when the models the governing class deploys are operating at a complexity that exceeds the unaugmented mind's ability to follow, the accountability relationship collapses. Not because the governed stop caring about accountability. Because accountability requires the capacity to evaluate, and the capacity to evaluate requires commensurable cognitive tools. The unaugmented voter evaluating the augmented governor's decision is not the less informed voter evaluating the better informed governor. It is the person without a microscope evaluating the person with one on whether the microorganism they are examining is the strain they claim. The tools are not merely different in quality. They are different in kind. An evaluation across that kind difference is not democracy. It is deference. Intelligent, well-intentioned deference, the best possible deference, but deference nonetheless. And deference is not accountability. And governance without accountability is not democracy. It is administration by the more capable of those who have accepted the administration because they cannot effectively evaluate whether a better alternative exists. The intelligence stratification contains within it a specific instability that the compound's architects model and that constitutes their most serious planning concern. The instability is this. The augmented governing class, in its cognitive isolation, its progressive certainty, its decade-long accumulation of confirming evidence for the wisdom of its prior decisions, will make, eventually, a decision that is wrong. Not marginally wrong. Structurally wrong. Wrong in the way that decisions made by cognitively isolated systems are eventually wrong, in a way that the isolation prevented them from seeing coming, in a way that the yes structure of the cognitively stratified environment failed to flag as a risk, in a way that the unaugmented periphery, with its diverse cognitive modes, its freedom from the governing class's specific augmented perspective, its access to the kinds of distributed, embodied, experimental knowledge that augmentation does not capture. The unaugmented periphery could have seen and tried to communicate and was not augmented enough to communicate informs the governing class's systems recognized as signal. The wrong decision comes. It always comes. For every stratified system that achieved sufficient cognitive isolation at the top, that surrounded its governing class with sufficient layers of filtered feedback, the wrong decision eventually came. The question is not whether it comes. The question is whether, when it comes, there is any mechanism, inside the compound, between the compound's layers, or outside the compound entirely, through which the error can be recognized, communicated, and corrected before the consequences become irreversible. The intelligence stratification systematically dismantles every such mechanism. The governing class cannot be effectively challenged from inside, the cognitive gap prevents effective challenge. The design class's anxiety makes internal dissent costly, the score, the position, the augmentation tier at stake. The operational class's cognitive provincialism limits its perception of the error, it can see that outcomes are wrong but cannot model why at the governing class's level. And the unaugmented periphery, which can see the error in its consequences, which can feel the wrongness in its lived experience, has no channel through which its perception reaches the governing class informs the governing class is cognitively equipped to receive. The compound has built a system that is very good at implementing decisions. It is progressively less good at recognizing when the decisions are wrong. And the recognition of wrongness, the capacity of a system to receive feedback that its current trajectory is mistaken, is not a minor governance feature. It is the thing that distinguishes a system that survives its errors from a system that doesn't. Intelligence stratification does not end with a revolution. Prior stratifications ended with revolutions, or with the slow democratic pressure that made revolution unnecessary by incorporating its demands. Intelligence stratification ends differently, if it ends, because the cognitive gap makes revolution in the prior sense structurally impossible. You cannot storm the Bastille if you cannot model the Bastille's defenses. You cannot draft a constitution if you cannot engage the constitutional discourse of those you are constituting against. You cannot make the sustained, strategic, long-horizon collective action that institutional change requires, if the cognitive tools required for that action are held inside the walls you are trying to breach. If the intelligence stratification ends, if the compound's particular organization of cognitive hierarchy is ever successfully challenged, it will be by something the stratification did not anticipate and cannot, by its nature, anticipate. The cognitive mode it does not measure. The creativity that constraint produces. The lateral thinking of those who have no access to the augmented infrastructure and must therefore find other routes through the problem. The specific insight that comes from experiencing the system from the outside, from feeling its consequences without the augmentation that makes those consequences invisible from within. The intelligence that cannot be measured by the compound's assessment systems because the compound's assessment systems were designed by people who have never had to navigate the world without augmentation, and who therefore do not know what cognitive capabilities the unaugmented world develops in the absence of what the compound provides. The compound is very intelligent. The compound has optimized its intelligence continuously and at great expense. What it has not optimized, cannot optimize, is its awareness of what it doesn't know. And what it doesn't know is what the unaugmented majority has learned in the space of its exclusion. The intelligence of the outside, the creativity of the constrained, the specific cognitive capabilities that develop in the absence of augmentation. Capabilities the compound systems have no category for because the compound systems were built by augmented minds that have never needed to develop them. Every stratification told itself the same story. The story was, this is natural. The story was, the hierarchy reflects reality. The story was, those above are above because they are more noble, more pure, more productive, more capable, more chosen. The story changed with each stratification. The structure did not change. The structure was always, those with the power to define the measure that places them above. The feudal lord defined noble blood as the measure, the industrial baron defined capital as the measure, the compound defines cognitive capability as the measure, and cognitive capability is real. This is the difference the compound is counting on. The realness of the measure is the compound's alibi, the thing that makes this stratification feel different from the prior ones, feel like the one that finally got the measure right, feel like the hierarchy that corresponds to nature rather than to power. But the measure is chosen. It is always chosen, and the choosing is the power. And the power chose. A measure that measures what the powerful have and calls it what everyone should want, and builds a civilization around the wanting and the having and the distance between them, and calls the distance natural, and the natural order is the compound, and the compound is the wall, and the wall is the measure made permanent, the hierarchy in stone or steel or the electrochemical interface between the augmented mind and the infrastructure that decided, before you were born, whether your cognition would be enhanced or left managed in its own. 19. The immortal boardroom. Power has always had a room. Not metaphorically. Literally. A physical space in which the people who make the decisions that determine the conditions of other people's lives gather to make those decisions, to deliberate, to negotiate, to agree, to produce the outcomes that then descend, through layers of implementation, into the world that most people inhabit without being invited into the room. The throne room. The war council. The cabinet. The boardroom. The specific furniture changes. The specific protocols change. The number of people in the room changes. What does not change is the structure, a small group, meeting in a space inaccessible to most, making decisions whose consequences are felt by everyone. Every prior version of this room had a feature that constrained it, a feature so fundamental that the constraint was invisible, the way gravity is invisible. The people in the room were going to die. Not today. Not this meeting. But the people in the room had a finite number of meetings remaining, a biological limit on how long they could occupy the room, on how long their specific configuration of relationships and judgments and accumulated positions could persist. The limit was the opening. The death was the door through which new people entered the room, carrying new relationships, new judgments, the perspective of a different formation, the corrective pressure of different experience. The immortal boardroom removes the door. The boardroom, as governance form, has always been the compound's truest expression, more than the charter city, more than the autonomous zone, more than the sovereign enclave. The charter city is the compound's geography. The autonomous zone is the compound's legal architecture. The boardroom is the compound's actual government, the room where the decisions are made that everything else implements. And the boardroom has always operated by a logic that democracy surrounded but never fully penetrated. Democratic governance made the political boardroom accountable, elections replaced the occupants, legislative oversight constrained the decisions, judicial review assessed the outcomes. The corporate boardroom was never fully democratized. Its members were accountable to shareholders, not citizens. Its decisions were constrained by market logic, not democratic mandate. Its outcomes were assessed by profit, not public good. The compound's boardroom is not accountable to shareholders. It is accountable to itself. Not to market logic, the compound's closed economy insulates it from market discipline. Not to democratic mandate, the compound has no democratic constituency. Not to judicial review, the compound has no external judiciary with jurisdiction over its decisions. The compound's boardroom is the purest form of boardroom ever constituted, small, self-selecting, self-governing, accountable to nothing outside the room. And, now, not replaced by death. What happens to a room when no one in it ever has to leave? This is not a rhetorical question. It is an engineering question, a question about system dynamics, about what any closed system does when the primary mechanism of renewal is removed. Systems theorists have a term for it, lock-in, the condition in which a system's prior decisions constrain its future options so completely that the range of possible futures narrows continuously, until the system is operating in a space defined almost entirely by the path it has already traveled. Lock-in does not feel like narrowing from inside the system. From inside, it feels like deepening, like the accumulation of experience and wisdom, like the refinement of judgment through iteration, like the progressive improvement of a system that is getting better at what it does. The narrowing is visible only from outside, only to those who can see the space that the system's path is no longer exploring, the options its prior decisions have closed off, the questions it can no longer ask because asking them would require acknowledging that a prior decision might have been wrong. The immortal boardroom is a lock-in machine. Not designed as one. Not intended as one. But structurally, inevitably, by the simple dynamics of what happens to any deliberative body when the composition is fixed, the relationships are permanent, and the members' shared history extends far enough that the history itself becomes the primary frame through which new situations are interpreted. The boardroom locks in. The specific dynamics of the immortal boardroom are worth examining with precision, not as abstraction but as the concrete social psychology of a specific kind of room, containing specific kinds of people, operating under specific conditions that no prior boardroom has operated under. The permanence of relationship. Every prior boardroom contained relationships, alliances, rivalries, debts, obligations, the social architecture of people who have worked together across a significant shared history. The immortal boardroom's relationships are permanent in a sense that prior boardroom relationships were not. In the mortal boardroom, relationships were bounded by the awareness, however unconscious, that the people in them would eventually not be in the room together. This awareness produced a specific quality of relationship management, the understanding that the alliance of today was the negotiation of tomorrow's succession, that the rival of this decade might be the partner of the next, that the relationship existed within a finite horizon that made certain kinds of intractable conflict ultimately resolvable by time. The immortal boardroom removes this horizon. The alliance of today is the alliance of the next century. The rivalry of today is the rivalry of the next century. The debt is permanent. The grudge is permanent. The specific social architecture of the room, who speaks first, who defers to whom, whose judgment carries weight on which topics, whose dissent is heard and whose is absorbed without consequence. This architecture, established in the founding period, does not evolve through the natural pressure of mortality. It calcifies. The social hierarchy of the founding moment becomes, over decades, the social hierarchy of the permanent moment, the arrangement that feels, to those within it, not like a contingent configuration but like the natural order of the room. The most consequential early decision in any immortal boardroom is therefore not a business decision or a governance decision or a strategic decision. It is the social decision, the establishment of the room's internal hierarchy, the determination of whose voice carries, whose dissent registers, whose vision of the compound's purpose becomes the frame within which all subsequent decisions are made. Because that determination, once made and extended by longevity across a century of operation, is not revised. The founding voice becomes the permanent voice. The founding vision becomes the permanent vision. The room does not revisit its premises. The premises are the room. The accumulation of shared certainty. Individual certainty accumulates with experience, the progressive narrowing of the space of doubt that comes from being right enough times that wrongness becomes difficult to imagine. Collective certainty, the certainty of a group, accumulates faster. The mechanism is social. Shared interpretation produces shared belief produces shared action produces shared outcome confirms shared interpretation. The loop runs continuously. In the Mortal Boardroom, the loop was broken periodically by the introduction of new members whose formation had occurred outside the loop, who brought, from their different experience, different interpretations, different beliefs, the friction of a perspective not yet absorbed into the room's consensus. The Immortal Boardroom does not introduce new members, not at the core level, not in the positions that carry interpretive weight. New people enter the room. Junior positions, advisory roles, the operational layer that serves the boardroom's directives. But the core, the people whose interpretation shapes the frame, is fixed. The loop runs without interruption. Shared certainty accumulates without friction. The room's consensus deepens from agreement into axiom, from the positions the members have concluded into the premises they no longer need to argue for because arguing for them has not been necessary for so long that the need to argue has become unimaginable. The room knows what it knows. It has known it for a long time. It has acted on it, and the actions have confirmed it. The knowing is, by now, less a belief than a structure, the architecture within which all deliberation occurs, visible no more than the room's walls are visible to those who have sat within them long enough to forget there are walls. The irreversibility of prior decisions. Every decision a boardroom makes constrains the decisions available to it afterward. This is the normal condition of governance. Decisions create dependencies, dependencies create constituencies, constituencies resist revision, and the boardroom that decides in year 1 finds its range of available decisions in year 10 substantially narrowed by what year 1 produced. In the Mortal Boardroom, this narrowing was periodically interrupted by the arrival of members who had not made the prior decisions, who had no personal investment in their defense, no pride at stake in their validation, who could evaluate the prior decision with the relative detachment of the uninvested. The uninvested evaluator could say, this was a mistake. Not, they made a mistake, which would be an attack on the prior members. But, the prior decision, evaluated against current conditions, no longer serves the purpose it was designed to serve. This is the sentence that the Immortal Boardroom cannot generate from within. Because the prior decision was made by the same people now being asked to revise it. The revision is not the uninvested evaluator's judgment. It is the admission of error by those who made the error. And the admission of error, in a room where the error makers are permanent, where their position depends on the narrative of their competence, where a century of operation has made competence the foundation of the room's self-understanding. The admission of error is not merely uncomfortable. It is structurally threatening. Because the Immortal Boardroom has built its legitimacy on the accumulated record of its decisions. Its claim to govern is, we have governed well. Admitting that a significant decision was wrong is not a governance correction. It is a legitimacy crisis. The boardroom avoids this by avoiding the admission, by finding, in every prior decision, the logic that was correct for its time, the conditions that have changed, the external factors that explain the suboptimal outcome. By producing, from the room's collective intelligence, the interpretation that protects the room's narrative while appearing to honestly evaluate the evidence. And the collective intelligence of the Immortal Boardroom is very good at producing this interpretation. Better than any individual member could produce alone. Better than any external critic can effectively challenge. Because the room has more information. More experience. More cognitive augmentation. More time in the specific situation being evaluated. The room's self-serving interpretation is, by every internal metric, the most sophisticated interpretation available. And sophistication, in the absence of external accountability, is indistinguishable from truth. The immortal boardroom has a specific relationship to succession that prior political theory has not developed adequate tools for. Prior theory of governance succession assumed that succession was necessary, that the question was not whether succession would occur but how to manage it, how to transfer authority without instability, how to ensure continuity without stagnation, how to select the successor who would best carry the institution forward. Succession planning was the central preoccupation of every long-lived governance structure, the problem that institutions solved or failed to solve and that determined, more than any other factor, their longevity. The immortal boardroom does not have a succession problem. It has a succession absence, a structural condition in which the question the institution has always had to answer is no longer being asked. The question is not being asked because the answer, the current members will continue, does not require planning. It requires only the longevity program. And the longevity program is operational. The succession absence has consequences that the boardroom experiences as advantages: no succession anxiety, no jockeying for position among potential heirs, no instability of the interregnum, no loss of institutional knowledge in the transition between generations. What it does not experience as a consequence, what it cannot experience as a consequence, because the consequence is the absence of something that was never present, is the renewal that succession provided. The new leader brought new questions. The new questions found old answers inadequate. The inadequate answers were revised. The revised answers produced new decisions. The new decisions produced new conditions. This is how institutions learned. This is how governance systems updated. This is the metabolism of institutional intelligence, the process by which a governance system remained adequate to the changing world it was governing. The immortal boardroom's metabolism has stopped. Not suddenly. Gradually. The way any metabolism stops when the conditions that drive it are removed, quietly, progressively, in the specific direction of the system's own prior tendency, without disruption, without crisis, without any moment at which the stopping is visible as the thing it is. The boardroom continues to deliberate. The deliberation is sophisticated. The decisions are implemented. The implementation is efficient. But the range of decisions available to the deliberation has narrowed. And the narrowing is not experienced as narrowing. It is experienced as focus, as the mature institution's understanding of what matters and what doesn't, of what questions are worth asking and what questions were settled long ago. The settled questions are the questions whose answers the boardroom cannot afford to revisit. And the questions whose answers cannot be revisited are the questions most in need of revision. Because they are the questions that were answered earliest, when the boardroom was youngest, when the world was most different from the world the boardroom now governs, when the confidence of the founders was least supported by evidence and most shaped by ambition. The founding vision. The founding certainty. The founding axioms that are now the room's walls. Invisible, permanent, unquestioned. Not because no one is brave enough to question them, but because the people who might question them have been in the room long enough to have forgotten that the walls were ever built. The immortal boardroom does not rule alone. It rules through a structure that has evolved, over the decades of its operation, into something for which the prior vocabularies of governance, democracy, oligarchy, technocracy, are simultaneously applicable and inadequate. It is oligarchic in its membership, a small group holds effective power. It is technocratic in its legitimation, the power is claimed on the basis of superior capability, the augmented cognitive advantage that makes the boardroom's decisions more sophisticated than any alternative the outside can produce. It is theocratic in its certainty, the boardroom's founding vision has, over the decades of its operation, acquired the quality of revealed truth, the quality of something that was not argued to but apprehended, by those capable of apprehending it, and that subsequent events have confirmed rather than challenged. And it is dynastic in its persistence, the specific individuals in the room are not replaced by successors but continue, the dynasty of the self rather than the dynasty of the bloodline, the perpetuation of the founding generation rather than its replacement by the next. This combination, oligarchic, technocratic, theocratic, dynastic, is not a known political form. It is a new form, generated by the conjunction of longevity technology and cognitive augmentation and private sovereignty and closed innovation. A form for which the political theory that might generate its critique has not yet been written. Because the political theory that critiques governance forms is written by the governed, by the people who experience the consequences of governance decisions without being party to the governance itself. And the governed, in the immortal boardroom's world, experiencing the consequences without the cognitive tools to derive them. Experiencing the outcomes without access to the decisions. Feeling the governance without being able to name what is governing them. There are historical echoes of the immortal boardroom that illuminate its character, not through precise parallel but through structural resonance. The Catholic Church's College of Cardinals, a small, self-selecting body with indefinite tenure, governing a transnational institution through a combination of doctrine, tradition, and internal deliberation, accountable to no external democratic body, approximates some features of the form. The differences are instructive. The cardinals are mortal. The cardinals are accountable, in a complex and attenuated sense, to a theological tradition that constrains their decisions and that the governed understand well enough to invoke against them. The immortal boardroom has neither constraint. The Venetian Council of Ten, a permanent, secret, self-renewing oligarchy that governed the Venetian Republic for centuries alongside its democratic institutions, approximates others. The difference is again, mortality generated rotation. The democratic institutions provided external pressure. The Venetian population was small enough to exert the social constraints that proximity produces. The immortal boardroom inhabits none of these constraints. The closest historical parallel is not a governance institution at all. It is a theological concept, the council of the eternal, the imagined body of beings outside time, outside succession, outside the constraints of finite existence, that various traditions have posited as the governing intelligence of the cosmos. Not a government of humans. A government of something else, something for which human categories of accountability and legitimacy were never designed to apply. The immortal boardroom is not divine. It is not outside time. It is biological, mortal in principle if not in practice, extended by technology rather than by nature. But it occupies a structural position in relation to the governed that prior human governance has only imagined as divine. The position of those for whom time moves differently, who plan across horizons the governed cannot reach, who carry forward decisions the governed have forgotten were made, who remember the founding moment not as history but as recent. Who are, in the practical sense that governance operates in, permanent. The immortal boardroom's most consequential decision is not any specific decision about strategy or policy or resource allocation. It is the decision it makes continuously, in every meeting, through every deliberation, by its mere persistence. The decision to continue. To continue as the boardroom. To continue as the governing structure. To continue as the specific configuration of people and relationships and axioms that has governed the compound since its founding. Prior boardrooms made this decision too, but made it each time a member died and a successor was chosen, each time the question of continuation was forced by the fact of ending. The immortal boardroom makes the continuation decision without being forced. It makes it in the absence of the event, the death, the succession, the transition, that would have required it to reconsider. The boardroom continues because no one has died to force the question of what comes next. And what continues, in the absence of that question, is not the compound's best current configuration, not the governance structure most adequate to the world as it currently is, but the compound's founding configuration, the governance structure most adequate to the world as it was when the founding generation was in the room for the first time, full of the specific certainties that the founding moment produced, facing the specific threats that the founding moment presented, making the decisions that made sense in the founding moment. And that have been, ever since, the room's walls. The founding generation governs. The founding generation has always governed. The founding generation will always govern. Until something happens that longevity cannot prevent. The boardroom knows this. It has modeled it. It has prepared for it with the intelligence that augmentation provides and the experience that decades of operation produces. It has prepared for every threat it can model. What it cannot model is what it has never encountered, the thing that has not yet happened, the challenge that has not yet taken form, the pressure that is building in the space the boardroom cannot see. The outside, with its distributed intelligence and its ferocious creativity and its specific knowledge of what the boardroom's decisions feel like from beneath. Assembling, in the space of its exclusion, the question the boardroom forgot to prepare for. Because the boardroom has been in the room so long, it forgot there was a world outside it. The room was built for meetings. Meetings have beginnings and ends. The meeting begins, the meeting ends, the members leave, the members return. This was the rhythm, this was the governance. The room waits between meetings, the members live their lives have an arc, the arc concludes, new members enter, the room begins again. This is how rooms stay rooms, by being left and returned to, by different people, who bring the outside in and take the inside out and keep the room a room and not a world. The immortal boardroom does not end the meeting continues, the members do not leave, the members live inside the meeting, inside the agenda, inside the deliberation, inside the specific frame that the meeting established at the founding and that no subsequent meeting has revised because no subsequent meeting has been subsequent. There is only the meeting, continuous, the same members, the same frame. The same walls that were once the room and are now the world, the only world the boardroom knows. The world it is governing. From Insidia, a meeting that has forgotten it is a meeting, that believes itself to be reality, that mistakes the agenda for the truth, the deliberation for the world, the room for everything that is, outside the room, everything that is continues, the room does not notice, the meeting goes on. 20. Biological class divide. The body was the one thing that class could not fully colonize. This is what every prior system of stratification ultimately failed to achieve, the thing that remained, however thoroughly the external conditions of life were organized around inherited advantage, the irreducible biological fact of the body itself. The aristocrat's body was not better. It was clothed better, fed better, rested better, protected from the specific degradations that poverty inflicts on human tissue, but it was the same biological architecture, the same vulnerability to disease, the same inexorable trajectory toward decay, the same ending. The body was the commons that class could not enclose. Birth was unequal. Education was unequal. Nutrition was unequal. Medicine was unequal. The circumstances that shaped the body's development were deeply, structurally unequal. But the body itself, the biological substrate of personhood, the physical fact of being human, was not different in kind across the class divide. The aristocrat's flesh was not aristocratic flesh. It was flesh. The same flesh as the serfs. Differently maintained. Not differently constituted. Biology was the floor, the level beneath which class distinction could not reach, the dimension of human existence in which the king and the peasant were, finally and irrevocably, the same kind of thing. The compound is building beneath the floor. Not improving the circumstances of the body. Altering the constitution of the body. Not different maintenance of the same biology. Different biology. This is the biological class divide, the first genuine speciation event in human history that is not natural selection but capital selection. The divergence of the human species not through the slow pressure of environment across evolutionary time but through the fast pressure of technology across a single generation. One class augmented, extended, enhanced, their biological architecture deliberately improved by the compound's medical infrastructure. The other class unaugmented, unextended, operating the biological equipment that 4 billion years of evolution produced and that the compound has decided is not worth improving for those outside its walls. The biological class divide operates across 3 distinct dimensions, each a different axis of biological differentiation, each reinforcing the others, each more consequential than any prior form of class-based biological inequality. The longevity divide. The most visible dimension. The one that will eventually be impossible to conceal as the compound's founding generation remains visibly functional past the point at which their unextended peers have aged and died. The longevity divide is not merely a difference in lifespan. It is a difference in the experience of time, in the relationship between a person and the duration of their existence, that produces different kinds of minds, different relationships to consequence, different calculations of risk and investment. The unextended person plans within a biological horizon. 40 years of productive adult life, perhaps. 50 with good fortune and good health. The plans that make sense within this horizon are the plans that can be completed within it, the investments that mature, the projects that conclude, the relationships that develop and end within a human lifetime. The extended person plans within a different horizon entirely. A century of productive adult life. Perhaps two. The plans that make sense within this horizon are categorically different, longer in their reach, more patient in their accumulation, more indifferent to the short-term fluctuations that dominate the unextended person's decision environment. The extended person can wait. The unextended person cannot. This asymmetry of patience is the most consequential practical consequence of the longevity divide, and the one that most thoroughly and most invisibly reorganizes the relationship between the classes. The investment that requires 50 years to mature cannot be made by the unextended person on behalf of themselves. It can be made by the extended person. The negotiation that requires 30 years of sustained pressure cannot be sustained by the unextended person across a biological lifetime already largely committed to other obligations. It can be sustained by the extended person. The compound that requires a century to build cannot be built by the unextended person who will not live to inhabit it. It can be built by the extended person who plans to live in what they build. The biological class divide is therefore also a temporal class divide, the divide between those who have time and those for whom time is the primary scarcity. And this temporal divide reorganizes every other dimension of advantage in favor of those for whom time is not scarce. The cognitive architecture divide. Neural augmentation produces not merely enhanced performance of existing cognitive functions, it produces, over time, different cognitive architecture. The augmented mind, operating for decades with the augmented layer as its primary interface with information, develops cognitive habits, cognitive strengths, and cognitive dependencies that progressively diverge from the cognitive profile of the unaugmented mind. The augmented mind's memory retrieval is precise. Used as the primary memory system across decades, it atrophies the reconstructive biological memory, the imprecise, creative, associative memory that biological minds use to navigate uncertainty. The augmented mind's analytical layer is comprehensive. Used as the primary analytical tool, it atrophies the biological brain's capacity for the kind of rapid, intuitive, heuristic-driven decision-making that is biological cognition's greatest adaptive advantage. The augmented mind's communication channel is high bandwidth. Used as the primary channel for complex communication, it atrophies the capacity for the slower, richer, more ambiguous communication of natural language, the communication that carries, in its imprecision, the emotional and relational information that high-bandwidth cognitive channels strip out as noise. The augmented mind, after decades of augmented operation, is not merely better than the unaugmented mind at the tasks augmentation optimizes for. It is different from the unaugmented mind, different in the specific way that any mind is different from a mind that has developed under systematically different conditions. The difference is not superiority in every dimension. The augmented mind has lost things that the unaugmented mind retains, the specific capabilities that augmentation made redundant and that redundancy allowed to atrophy. But the difference is real. And the difference, accumulated across decades of divergent cognitive development, produces minds that process the world differently, that reason differently, remember differently, communicate differently, make decisions differently. In ways that are not merely the difference between a trained mind and an untrained one, or a well-resourced mind and a poorly resourced one, but the difference between minds that have been shaped by fundamentally different environments. Which is to say, by fundamentally different biologies. The biological maintenance divide. The compound's medical infrastructure delivers a quality of biological maintenance to its residents that differs from what is available outside not merely in degree but in kind. This is the dimension of the biological class divide that is most immediately consequential for the lived experience of those on each side of it, and most invisible to those on the inside, who experience their maintained health as the natural condition rather than the delivered product of an infrastructure most of humanity does not have access to. Inside the compound, continuous biological monitoring. Every relevant physiological parameter tracked in real time, deviations from optimal range identified before they become symptomatic, interventions deployed before disease develops. Not treating illness. Preventing it. The distinction is categorical. Treating illness means allowing the biological system to degrade to the point of symptomatic malfunction before intervening. Preventing it means maintaining the biological system within optimal parameters continuously, never allowing the degradation that produces the symptom. The compound's resident does not experience disease in the way the unextended, unmonitored person experiences it, as the unexpected arrival of suffering, as the body's sudden betrayal. They experience, occasionally, a notification, a parameter adjustment, an intervention so early in the disease process that the disease never develops its characteristic symptoms. They experience health as a continuous condition, as the baseline, as normal. Outside the compound, disease management. The treatment of conditions after they develop. The management of chronic illness that continuous monitoring would have prevented. The aging of the biological system at the rate the unmanaged system ages, which is faster, which is more painful, which is the experience that most of humanity understands as the natural course of a human life. The biological class divide here is not the divide between good medicine and bad. It is the divide between medicine that maintains the body and medicine that responds to the body's deterioration. Between a body that does not deteriorate and a body that does. Between the experience of health as normal and the experience of health as temporary, as the interval between sicknesses, the reprieve before the next diagnosis, the window of capability before the next inevitable decline. The biological class divide has a specific relationship to reproduction that prior class divides did not have, and that constitutes, in the long run, its most consequential dimension. Prior class divides were reproduced socially. The aristocrat's child was born aristocratic not because their biology was different, it was not, but because the social structures that constituted aristocratic status were transmitted through inheritance, through education, through the networks that class membership enabled. The biological class divide is reproduced biologically. The compound child is born into the compound's biological infrastructure, born to extended parents whose longevity therapies and nutritional optimization and prenatal monitoring and genetic assessment have produced a gestation environment categorically superior to anything available outside. Born with early augmentation, the developmental protocols adapted for young minds, designed to produce the cognitive architecture that the compound's educational and professional systems are calibrated to develop. Born with a biological trajectory, a projected lifespan, health span, cognitive trajectory, that is determined not by the accident of genetics alone but by the managed environment into which the child is born and within which their biology will develop. The compound child's biology is not merely better maintained. It is differently constituted, shaped, from the earliest developmental stages, by the compound's biological infrastructure. So that the adult the child becomes is not merely a more advantaged version of what an outside child would have become. They are a different kind of adult, biologically different, in the specific ways that decades of differently constituted development produce different organisms. This is not eugenics in the historical sense, the selection and elimination of genetic characteristics by state authority. It is something both more subtle and more consequential, the environmental shaping of biological development through differential access to biological infrastructure, the production of biological advantage not by selecting genes but by managing the environment in which genes express. The compound does not select better genes. It creates better conditions for gene expression. The result, across a generation, is similar, a population whose biology has been shaped by the compound's management in ways that diverge, progressively, from the biology of the population outside its walls. The outside child's biology is not worse by design. It is worse by neglect, by the withdrawal of the biological infrastructure that the compound has concentrated inside its perimeter, by the environmental conditions of the abandoned majority shaping biology in the direction that poverty, pollution, stress, and inadequate nutrition have always shaped it. The biological class divide reproduces itself in the bodies of the next generation. Not through inheritance of wealth alone, not through transmission of social position alone, but through the biological development of children in environments that the class divide has made fundamentally different. The biological class divide creates a specific moral problem that the compounds philosophy has developed an elaborate architecture to avoid confronting directly. The moral problem is this. If the biological differences between the compound class and the outside majority are the product of differential access to biological infrastructure, if the compound child's biological advantages are not intrinsic to the child but delivered by the compound's medical systems, then the biological class divide is not a reflection of natural difference. It is a production of inequality, the active manufacture of biological advantage for some through the active denial of biological investment for others. This is the moral problem. The compound's response to this problem is not an argument. It is an architecture. The architecture has two components. The first is the meritocratic frame. The compound's biological investment is directed at those who demonstrate sufficient value to justify the investment. The investment is not arbitrary. It is not inherited. It is earned by the cognitive contribution that earns entry, by the productive output that earns continued residency, by the sustained performance that justifies the ongoing biological infrastructure. The biology is the reward of merit. The outside's biology is the consequence of its own choices, the choice not to develop sufficient value for entry, the choice to remain outside, the biological consequences of that choice borne by those who made it and, regrettably, by their children, but this regrettable transmission is not the compound's responsibility. The compound did not produce poverty. The compound did not produce the biological conditions of poverty. The compound is not responsible for the biological consequences of conditions it did not create, and which, the compound notes, it is working to eventually address through the innovations it is developing for eventual distribution. Eventually. The second component is the naturalization frame. The biological differences produced by the compound's infrastructure, once produced, are presented as natural differences, as the biological reflection of the cognitive value hierarchy that the compound's assessment systems measure. The compound's residents are cognitively superior, this is why they are residents. Their cognitive superiority is reflected in their biology, which the compound's infrastructure maintains at superior levels. Their children inherit cognitive and biological advantage, which is the natural transmission of natural advantage. The manufacture is hidden in the maintenance. The inequality is hidden in the nature. The biology that the compound produces through investment is presented as the biology that the compound recognizes through assessment. The circle is closed. The production of advantage looks, from inside the frame, like the recognition of it. And the frame is so complete, so sophisticated, so thoroughly integrated into the compound's self-understanding and its public presentation, that those inside it do not experience the frame as a frame. They experience it as reality. The outside body ages. This is the simplest and most complete statement of what the biological class divide produces at the level of lived experience. The outside body ages at the rate the unmanaged biological system ages, which is the rate that poverty and pollution, stress and inadequate nutrition, the cumulative physical cost of lives organized around survival rather than optimization, produce. This rate is faster than the biological baseline. Much faster than the maintained body inside. The outside body accumulates damage. The damage is not catastrophic. It is chronic, the slow degradation of biological systems under conditions of sustained suboptimal maintenance, the drift from health toward managed impairment that is the trajectory of most human lives outside any system of adequate biological investment. Chronic pain. Cognitive decline that begins earlier than biology requires. The specific diseases of poverty, cardiovascular, metabolic, respiratory, that are diseases of environment as much as of biology. The accelerated aging of the body under chronic stress, the biological clock that runs faster when the conditions of life run harder. The outside person at 50 is biologically older than the compound person at 80. Not because the outside person is biologically inferior. Because the compound person's biology has been maintained, and the outside person's has not. This difference, visible in the body, legible in the face, measurable in every biomarker that the compound systems continuously monitor, is the biological class divide in its most immediate and most personal expression. The face of the outside compared to the face of the inside, across the wall, at the gate, where the outside person stands in the body that their circumstances have produced. And the compound person stands in the body that the compound's infrastructure has maintained. And the difference between the two faces looks, to both of them, like the difference between someone who has lived well and someone who has not. When it is, in fact, the difference between someone whose body has been invested in and someone whose body has not. The biological class divide has a horizon, a point beyond which the divergence becomes large enough to constitute a difference not of degree but of kind, that the compound's architects have been modeling carefully and discussing privately for longer than the outside knows. The horizon is the point at which the biological differences between the compound class and the outside majority become large enough to constitute, not metaphorically, but clinically, different biological categories. Not different races, in the historical sense, the compound's architects are too sophisticated to invoke that vocabulary. Different biological profiles, different in the specific ways that matter for cognitive capability, for physical resilience, for the biological capacity to function at the level the compound's world requires. The horizon is approached from both sides. The compound's residents are maintained above the biological baseline, their systems optimized, extended, augmented, maintained at levels of function that the unmanaged biology cannot sustain. The outside majority is maintained below the biological baseline, their systems degraded by the conditions of abandonment, aging faster than biology requires, accumulating the biological consequences of environments the compound's withdrawal has impoverished. Both trajectories are active. Both are moving. The gap between them widens from both directions simultaneously. The compound's architects see the horizon approaching. They have modeled its implications with the augmented cognitive infrastructure that the outside cannot match. The model produces a specific conclusion that the architects discuss with the careful vocabulary of people who understand that some conclusions cannot be stated plainly without producing the exact response they are designed to prevent. The conclusion is: after the horizon, the political argument for the biological class divide's legitimacy changes character. Before the horizon, the argument is contested, the differences are the product of differential investment, the investment could be extended, the biology could converge if the infrastructure were shared. After the horizon, the differences are constitutive, they cannot be rapidly reversed by the extension of infrastructure, they are embedded in the developmental histories of two populations that have been diverging long enough that the divergence is not a gap but a separation. And the argument for the compound's governance of the outside population shifts from "we are more capable because we are better maintained" to "we are more capable because we are differently constituted." The argument that every prior biological hierarchy has made and that the compound has been careful, until the horizon, to avoid. Because before the horizon, the argument is false, the difference is produced, not inherent. After the horizon, the argument becomes, in the specific clinical sense that the compound's models describe it, partly true. And a hierarchy with a partly true biological argument for its existence is the most durable hierarchy in human history. Because it can say, with a portion of the evidence on its side, "Look at us, look at what we are, look at what you are, the difference is not injustice. The difference is biology." Part 4 ends here, at the body. At the most intimate and most irreversible expression of what the compound secession produces. Not the exclusion of the majority from resources, which has been done before and undone before, but the exclusion of the majority from the biological infrastructure that determines what kind of body a person has. What kind of mind? What kind of life? What kind of future the future holds for this specific configuration of flesh and cognition that the person was born as and that the biological class divide has decided, before they were born, how long and how well they will inhabit. The compound did not create biological difference. It is creating it now, in the bodies of children on both sides of the wall. The maintained bodies inside, the unmaintained bodies outside. Diverging. Quietly. in the specific direction that the compound's infrastructure and the outside's abandonment have been producing together since the first wall went up and the first biological program was extended to those inside and withheld from those without. The divergence that began as policy and is becoming, slowly, irrevocably, biology. The body was the floor beneath which class could not reach. The serf's body and the lord's body were the same body, differently maintained, not differently made. Flesh was the commons, the one commons that enclosure could not enclose. The compound has found the way beneath the floor, not through the body's surface, not through the external conditions that prior inequality shaped, through the body's interior, through the biological processes that constitute the body itself, the aging mechanisms, the cognitive architecture, the developmental environment that determines what the body becomes. The compound did not assault the floor. It excavated beneath it, quietly, in the language of medicine and optimization, in the vocabulary of health and longevity and cognitive enhancement, good words, genuinely good things, deployed in the service of the oldest project, the conversion of the commons into property. The body is now property, not your body specifically, your body is still yours, but the infrastructure that determines what your body can become, how long it lives, how well it functions, what cognitive capabilities it develops, how it ages, what it passes to your children. That infrastructure is inside the wall, and what is inside the wall belongs to those who built it. The floor has been excavated, the commons has been enclosed, the body, the last body, the one thing that was the same for everyone, is no longer the same. The divide is biological. The biology is the divide, and the wall runs through the body now, not around it. Through it, dividing not territory but tissue, not geography but flesh, not where you live but what you are, and what your children will be, and their children, and theirs. The divergency compounding in every generation that the compound maintains and the outside does not, until the floor that was the commons is so far beneath the compound's feet that they cannot see it anymore, cannot remember that the floor was ever there, that the body was ever the same.
X Prize. Start building, man.
The winning solutions will demonstrate that replication, not growth, is the correct unit of scale for global provisioning.
X Prize. Start